Hello, and welcome to this Ingenta webinar, Connected Publishing through Online Communities with Zapnito. Ingenta produce various products for publishers, including publishing platforms, ideal for engaging readers, researchers, and other users, discovering relevant types of content you publish. Our platforms include Ingenta Edify, Ingenta Connect, Unity, Ingenta Connect, and Ingenta Open. These products cater for different business models and offer various hosting and branding options. Please get in contact with Ingenta to learn more. In this webinar, John Beer, CTO and co-founder of Zapnito, will discuss online communities for publishers. The internet has become a noisy place, and publishers are often challenged to connect with their readers, authors, and other key audiences. John will explain more about these challenges and discuss the benefits of creating your own online communities, targeted specifically at the people you want to connect with. He will discuss how communities can address those challenges and help you diversify revenue streams using some examples. Zapnito is a content-led community platform that helps publishers connect with the people that matter to their business. John is an experienced technical leader with 19 years experience implementing web technologies with a specialism in data delivery and online business intelligence systems. I will now pass you over to John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to say welcome to everybody today to the webinar. So just moving on to the first slide. So as you know, we will be covering what we refer to as connected publishing through online communities. At the end of the webinar, there will be some contact details there. So if you want to just reach out to me, then please do so. So just moving on to the slides. So in terms of the agenda for today, about the webinar, we'll be covering the benefits of creating your own online communities. So those are things like obviously generating new revenue streams and engaging with your audience. We'll be looking at the challenges facing publishers today, which I expect most people on the webinar will be familiar with, reaching their audiences and how online communities can help. We'll also talk about some examples of how publishers can use online communities to diversify revenue streams, which is obviously particularly interesting, I expect, to most people. And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll cover off some case studies, Springer Nature and Central Media, and Future Science Group, which are case studies from Zapnito. In terms of the sections of the webinar, part one will be the main topic for the webinar around connected publishing. We'll talk through some ideas and thoughts from Mark Allen, who's the former Wiley CEO on connected publishing. What I would like to do also is just talk a little bit about the evolution of digital publishing as a background to this topic, because it's obviously very important in terms of how the internet has revolutionized the publishing industry over the last 30 to 40 years. We'll cover data ownership and customer ownership, which is obviously alluding to on this agenda in terms of the big social giants, Facebook and Google and so on. We'll talk about connected content as a concept, and then we'll move on to some ideas around building communities around trusted brands, which is obviously very important. And so that will be part one, and then part two we'll move on to some case studies, which I've already referred to, and then at the end of the webinar we'll just talk a little bit more about Zapnito in terms of Zapnito's vision and what we're doing as a company. So part one, would like to just kick this off actually with a quote. This is from Mark. Just a disclaimer: Mark is an advisor to Zapnito, so we're quite closely connected with Mark. But he's obviously a thought leader in this space, and definitely worthwhile following what he's up to. He's always got some interesting ideas about our industry. So his quote here: "I believe the future of digital media will be driven by the powerful integration of networks and high-value content." So what he's really alluding to here is how communities and how networks of individuals add value to content. So obviously content has value in its own right. It's highly valuable in its own right. But when you can put that content within the context of a network of individuals that are interested in that particular topic area, then the value of that content is elevated in an exponential way. And hopefully that will come across as we go through through the webinar. I would like, actually, before I move on, to say if you do feel the need to ask a question on a particular slide, then please do so as we go. It's always nice to have a bit more of an interactive webinar, I feel. But if the question is not so relevant to the current slide, then we may just answer that towards the end. So some more ideas or thoughts from Mark Allen. So that's Mark there on the left. So essentially, previously, publishing was essentially a broadcast medium, as I'm sure everyone on the webinar would know. It was essentially, publishers would take some content from an author or a researcher. They would edit it. They would print it into a magazine or a journal, and they would distribute it to their audience or their subscribers. And that worked very well for a long time, for 300 years or more. And so moving on to the current era of digital technology has enabled essentially direct connection between the reader and the publisher. So in the broadcast, prior to that, the information flowed in one direction, essentially from the author to the publisher to the reader, and there's no information coming backwards. And digital technology has essentially allowed the readers and the audience to communicate back to the publisher. And so that actually presents an opportunity to publishers to provide the tools to allow those readers to engage more. But how can they do that? And I think that's something we'll cover off, or that's something we will cover off on the webinar. And essentially, the third point as well here that Mark's making is that content consumers can actually interact directly with each other, which is actually quite, adds a third dimension to this challenge. They can talk with one another, they can share information, share data in new and powerful ways. And authors can also self-publish. They can bypass a publisher directly. They can go straight to their readers. So there's some interesting dynamics happening in the last sort of 7 to 8 years of these markets opening up. The other fourth point on this slide, which is critical as well, is that the digital medium has actually changed attitudes to how content is open or closed in all forms of publishing. Really, most consumers, or many consumers these days, kind of expect content to be free and open. They're used to getting information on the internet for free. They're used to getting it instantly, particularly younger generations. They're not prepared to wait, and so that kind of expectation, if you like, has really sort of raised questions around traditional publishing business models and who's funding that readership, whether it's universities or if it's traditional sort of newspaper businesses. How do they still make revenue? And so what does this mean for publishers? It means that their business models are seriously under threat. Many publishing businesses have already collapsed. Lots of this industry is already having problems. So lots of these points will be very familiar to people on the webinar, I'm sure. But it's good to just cover them off as we lead into the concept of connected publishing. So the next slide is really about just a sort of an infographic of what I've just talked through, actually. So previously there was a static print-based type delivery mechanism for information, and that actually, audiences were quite loyal in that world. People would subscribe to a particular newspaper, or they would subscribe to a particular journal, and they were happy with that. And that, sort of pre 1990, I suppose, or pre 1995. And then moving on from there into sort of late 90s, very early 2000s, the publishing industry moved into more of a closed. They tried to implement a closed model of digital rights management, which is a phrase you never really hear anymore. DRM, paywalls and pay to consume, and that kind of a few publishers experimented that, but I don't think there's many successful examples of that back in those days. And then moving on to sort of 2004 onwards. Late 2000s, the social media revolution really happened. Sort of around 2004, Facebook, 2007, Twitter. Towards the end of that period, at that point there's 300 million bloggers out there, all publishing their opinions about things, claiming to be experts, claiming to be thought leaders, but no one really knows, do they actually know what they're talking about or not? And all of that content is, of course, open, and it's there for free. And that's led to the huge problem of noise, and a very familiar term, but we're all familiar with now, fake news. No one really knows if they read something on the internet if it's true or not. and the internet's flooded with cat videos. So unfortunately, the internet was not really at that point being used for what Tim Berners-Lee intended it to be used for, which was for experts to share and collaborate with one another. And so from the last blob there on the right hand side is actually where Zapnito is and our customers are sort of moving towards. It's a trust-based environment where established brands build communities of recognized experts, recognized individuals, and these communities are essentially curated by the brand, and they provide this connected content, connected publishing value amongst the brand. So it's nice to just put that in the context of the history to see how we've got to where we are today. So the next few slides are really talking about the data ownership, about who owns the customer now, where do we read, where do we search, and where do we buy, and everyone is very familiar these days with the digital landscape is very much dominated by the tech giants, the Facebooks and Googles and Amazons of this world, in terms of a B2C media. And then obviously in scientific publishing particularly, you've got things like Scopus, Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and Sci-Hub. And these are places where people go to get content first. They don't necessarily go to the publishing brands so much anymore. They'll go to those giants first. And this means that the value has migrated away from content and actually moved towards advertising and software and apps. In terms of software, I'm familiar with a few players in the publishing space who actually started off as software companies, and then through their software companies in the publishing space, and they've evolved into publishing companies, and their heritage is actually as software companies, which is quite an interesting viewpoint. And also, these are still points from Mark that there's still a multi-billion-dollar world of value surrounding content, but actually those billions of dollars are flowing to Google and Facebook. They're not flowing to publishers. But we essentially we believe, Zapnito and also Ingenta, that there's actually a trump card. So the publishers have a trump card, which is communities, and those communities provide a trump card by connecting the content, connecting the brand, and connecting the community together to elevate the value of the content together. So there's also some good examples out there. So Guardian actually is a very good example of how they completely revolutionized their funding model into a sort of a club, essentially. So they did a very, very good job over the last 2 or 3 years of promoting the quality of their content to their readers and persuading their readers to join the Guardian club. And so if you read up on the history of how the Guardian have done that, it's very, very interesting how they've managed to turn their fortunes around by building a community of believers, essentially. And so hopefully through these slides, we'll just talk through some real life use cases of how other publishers can take a similar model. The next slide actually is just sort of putting these brands sort of front and center, if you like. If you don't own the community, you don't own the audience either. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, if you're building an audience on these platforms, then you're essentially building that audience on behalf of those platforms. You're giving that audience to Facebook, and Facebook own the data, and you're essentially giving away the what's the expression, the jewels in the closet. The family heritage is being given away to the platforms, and so we'll show you some examples of how to avoid doing that, but still reach your goals. This slide is really a bit more detail around that problem. 45% of American adults now get their news from Facebook, which is quite worrying, really, if you think about the control that Facebook can have over the news feed, and Mark Zuckerberg's agenda, if he has one. 84% of global spending of digital ads goes to Google and Facebook. Amazon controls 50% of all book sales across the US, and 83% of all ebook sales. So they're huge monopolies. And their dominance is quite worrying when it comes to the data and control over what users see. So, for example, if Facebook was to change their newsfeed algorithm, which they do, They can do that without any kind of notification to publishers. You may have spent a lot of time curating your content and audience to a particular algorithm that Facebook has implemented on their newsfeed, and they may change that overnight, and your reader numbers can just plummet without you having any control over that. There's also no recourse to a situation. Many publishers are actually putting lots of effort to build the communities on those platforms, and then they have to pay Facebook to reach them. They have to pay Google to reach them. So it's not a good situation at all. Just on the right-hand side there, Google owns over 90% of search engine market around the world. Amazon's control of book sales, again, is 50%, said that. And then also social media advertising in 2018 was $51 billion. So it's an astronomical number. So the next slide, actually, we're just moving on to, there's another quote here by a guy named Professor Bharat Anand. He wrote a book called The Content Trap. And so the power of content is increasingly overwhelmed by the power of user connections. And so what he's referring here to is essentially what's known as the network effect. So the number of network connections is kind of exponentially more powerful than the content itself. And so just move on to some other slides. We'll talk through that. So yeah, that's just talking about the same kind of thing. So what he's really talking about is that the content businesses can get caught in this trap of assuming that their content is enough, and that's not actually the case anymore. You can produce really, really valuable content, but it's really not very often that people just want to read the content itself. People often will want to engage with the community around that topic area. People are interested in making connections, and when they make those connections, then the value of that content is elevated as almost like a logarithmic scale. So that is a really interesting book. It's worth picking up. And so one of the examples here is at the bottom of key points on this slide is actually from a long time ago. Apple produced the Apple I computer, which was very highly designed, beautiful machine, really innovative, had lots of awesome features on it. But actually it was not very successful at all. It only captured 3% of the market. And actually people went out and bought IBM PCs, which were ugly. They probably were unreliable, but what those PCs did let them do was they could connect with, you could connect with other people through those PCs. So it's a sort of a hardware example rather than a content example, but it just shows how the network effect can really change the business model. So another quote here from Mark Allen. This is important, actually. So online communities, in some cases, some publishers have tried to build their own online communities. Maybe if you go back 5, 6, 7 years ago, a few examples I can think of where they've really sort of chased the big numbers. They've really tried to say, you know, we're going to launch an online community for the whole of the scientific community, and their key metric that they've been chasing is getting all of the scientists in the world on their social network, and then I think pretty much all of those may have probably failed. So one thing that we've learned through time is actually successful communities are usually niche communities. They're actually communities in a specific topic, and they have direct brand relevance. And that's where you have sort of meaning. The communities on those niche communities provide some relevance. So it's not just about saying, okay, we want to have a community in all of chemistry, for example. You might want to have a community in biochemistry, and that's where people are talking and that's where people are interacting. So the niche aspect of this is very, very important to consider before you go off and launch an online community. So just talking about this a bit further, publishers need to find ways to harness what they already do well. And the key here is content and its trusted brands. And taking those two things together really it does obviously allow building communities around trusted brands to really be successful. The next slide here is actually kind of an example of that in terms of the contrast between a social network engagement for an audience and a trusted brand engagement. So if you're launching a community on Twitter or Facebook, you might have, say, if you reached 1,000 people or 100,000 people, the percentage of people that are actually engaged in that community on the social networks is actually a very, very low percentage. And this comes from research from University of Michigan. They took an example where a company had launched their own branded community and spent a lot of time fostering that community, and the members of that community spent 19% more in terms of purchasing from that company's products than they would have done on the equivalent social network communities. And so one example that comes to mind about is GIFGAF, which people may be familiar with, which is a telecommunications provider. They very successfully have built their own online community of the user support community is very successful for that company, GIFGAF. It's not in the publishing domain, but it's in the telecommunications domain. So there's a quote here again. This is again from Mark. The most successful information providers will likely be those that are able to assist in curating information. And so again, this example, so The Guardian again is a sort of the groundbreaking use of the strength of their community to launch a new funding model, and then also Springer Nature communities of practice. I have linked on these slides out to examples, but unfortunately we can't give you a live demo during the webinar. So later on we'll just show you some screenshots of those. But the key thing really about any community is that it should be the go-to destination for that topic for the community, and it's very focused on learning from peer-to-peer learning essentially, and sharing and discussion about a particular topic. And the other key element that's very, very important, actually it's probably the most important aspect, is the people themselves. It's very easy to think, oh, the content is enough, but in fact, actually get the people obviously are the ones that are creating the content. The people are the ones that are talking about the content, and their presence and being able to discover each other and talk with one another is absolutely critical. And so community, obviously the community will provide a space to discuss subjects they're interested in and learn from one another. We've talked about it not being about big numbers actually, but it's about necessarily niche communities. So you might have a community that only has 40 people in it, but that might be big enough for it to be relevant and useful for those people. So just summarizing some of the community benefits: new revenue streams through subscription content, and this actually can be subscriptions to user-generated content. If you've built a good enough community where your users are generating content on your behalf, you can actually generate subscription revenues to that content. Sponsorship through things like thought leadership, and obviously advertising as well. And advertising is actually quite successful because it's very, very targeted. In the case of online communities, advertising works quite well because it's so targeted. Event audience engagement, this is another good example. We have a client, the OECD. They've launched a community for all around their annual event where they're engaging with economic thought leaders and policy makers in Europe and it's providing a sort of a 365 online community for the people that are going to the event every year. And they actually use it to provide guidance into the topics that the event should cover. Every time the event happens, they reach out to the community and say, you know, what are the things that we should be talking about at the next event. Product development is an interesting one. It's actually very good. Community is a very good tool to provide guidance and insight into should you launch a new journal on a new topic. You can go to the community and get some very, very useful information about whether that's the right topic or the right niche for a new journal. And then obviously peer-to-peer learning and company-led learning are things that can happen on online communities. Ultimately, though, this word here, trust, is kind of the elephant in the room, if you like, around why this is so important. If you connect your brand, it's very likely that your brand already has that trust factor. And so, but if you can put your brand alongside the community itself, then that's when the magic happens. So just moving on to, so that concludes part one. Hopefully that's given you a sort of an overview of what we mean by connected publishing. And just to illustrate some of those as examples, we'll move on to part two, which will cover some case studies. So the quote here from Phil Garner. He's the managing director of Future Science Group. Future Science Group are mainly a scientific publisher, mainly open access journals based in London, and they've really actually generating quite a significant proportion of their revenue now is coming from advertising and sponsored thought leadership on their online communities. The next slide is just saying basically the same thing, a bit of a background into FSG. They were really looking back in 2014. They're actually an early customer for Zapnito. They were really looking to build new ways to diversify their revenue. At that time, open access was still relatively new. I think it's not so huge as it is now. And so they were looking for new ways to diversify their revenue, and online communities have really helped them do that. The next slide is talking about just looking at some examples. So if they want to launch a new community with that Zapnito, they can launch a new one within a matter of weeks. So one thing that's quite important is if you're launching a community, you might not get the topic right first time round. Your choice of topic might be too broad, or it might be too niche. So one thing is that you should have flexibility to change that as you learn what the community are most interested in. And so some of the examples they have, RegMedNet, which is regenerative medicine. That's scientists and researchers and clinicians talking about growing stem cells, for example, in the lab. 3D MedNet is quite a really interesting example of doctors and researchers and clinicians using 3D printing for saving people's lives, essentially. And RxNet is a sort of biochemistry network. And so these guys, they're launching these communities very quickly. If they see an opportunity, they can launch it in sort of 2 to 3 weeks, and test it as they go. Unfortunately, I'm not able to click out from the webinar to show you a live example. So we've just got some screenshots here. This is RegMedNet. So after the webinar, I'd recommend people have a look. So this is just sort of a homepage. It's very content focused. This is on the right hand side is a screenshot of an article published actually by the community manager themselves. So Zapnito communities are very content led. We believe that the value is very high on the content side. So Zapnito communities are quite focused on the people and the content, and so you'll see that they're less forum style. So many communities online will be sort of noisy forums, and so we tend to avoid that kind of model because lots of noisy forums don't necessarily add value back to the community or in terms of back to the publisher as well. So this is quite a nice example of a content-led forum, and it's very advertising and sponsorship-led. So yeah, just have a look at that, and also some of the FSG examples as well. Next example case study is from Springer Nature. So a quote here from Stephen Inchcombe, who's the Chief Publishing Officer. So we're not trying to create broad social networks. This is about bringing focused communities together without all the noise. So Springer Nature, they have around 30 plus communities with Zapnito, and it's really kind of, I guess here, this is really sort of hammering the point home. Actually, it's sort of strengthening ties with researchers. So what they're doing really is launching online communities, which are sort of adding services back to their researchers and their authors, and providing a platform for community discussion around the journals. So they can launch a new community very rapidly. And what they're doing at this point in time, they launch the community first. So there's some journals next year that Springer Nature are launching, and they've launched the community 6 to 9 months before they launch the journal, and then they're using the journal to really get the community corralled around the topic, if you like, and that's then influencing the editorial pathway for the journal itself. So it's a really interesting model where the community is having a lot of input into the product. So some of these bullet points here. So they've had 1.6 million page views on the various communities. Over 2,000 last year, over 2,000 items of content, and that's content coming from the community. It's not content coming from Springer Nature's editorial team. it's really very successful. And these are very niche focused communities, providing a sort of a safe space away from social noise. And it's also, as I mentioned, kind of a good way for the researchers to engage with Springer Nature itself. So imagine you're a postdoctoral researcher at a university, you're finishing your research, and you can actually engage with the editorial team at Nature itself, which is quite an interesting place to be. So some of the, on the right hand side here, there's 4 kind of use cases, I suppose, that Springer Nature use Zapnito for online communities. There's the classic scientific research communities where they have a community which is aligned very closely to the journal. So one of the screenshots I'll show you next is the Ecology and Evolution journal. And so that's very closely aligned to the journal. But then they also have communities which are more sort of horizontal, if you like, where they're just going through not so closely related to the journal itself, but more cross-cutting across a different topic area. They also have what we call private journal editorial board communities. So scientific reports and some of the Biomed Central communities are private communities which are providing a space for the editorial board members to talk about what their processes are and how learn how to be an editorial board member, essentially. They also have thought leadership sites. So this small screenshot here is from an example, which is Yakult, which is a yogurt drink. They sponsored some grants in gut health, which is quite an interesting one. And then there's also online training products where Springer Nature are launching training material delivered by the editorial team at Nature and then sold through to the universities. So you might be a University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, and have access to training products from the editorial team. So again, on the left-hand side, generating revenue. These training products are site license type subscription models, paid for thought leadership sites, and then advertising as well. So obviously you can read through those bullet points. These are just some screenshots from the Ecology and Evolution site. So you can see here all of this content coming in, very frequent content. Dining with microbes, brewer's yeast. That was contribution from one of the users, and all these people are trusted experts that Springer Nature have essentially curated. They've improved these experts to be contributors, and so these people are free to add content to this site. And Springer Nature know that these people are relevant and the right people to be on these sites. And on the right hand side here, you can see an example of an expert profile. Tiago Simões, he's one of their contributors, and so as a visitor to this community, I can see his popular content. I can contact him. I can see that he's from Harvard University. I can see the topics he's contributed to, and so other examples of expert profiles will also show other people that are similar to him, so to facilitate peer-to-peer networking, for example. So that's just an example. I would recommend going to this site as well, Ecology and Evolution Community. I should have put the domain name on here, but I can send it to you afterwards if you're interested. Another example is Nature Masterclasses that I referred to briefly on the case study slide. This is an example of where Springer Nature have launched an online training community. On the right-hand side, you can see an example of a training course. So this is a training course in scientific writing. They've got 5 or 6 modules. So there's a module on what makes a great paper. So as a subscriber to this content, I can watch videos, I can read content from the editorial team. So I can learn from Chris Surridge, as an example, what makes a great paper. So that's, as a researcher publishing my research for the first time, it's a very useful resource. The next one is an example of a scientific reports editorial site that I referred to. So this is a private community, so unfortunately I can't show you any screenshots from that, but it is it's just a good example of what a private community can look like, in the sense that these can be quite closed communities as well. If there's some type of workflow which requires people to join. I'm just going to move a bit faster because I think I'm sort of running out of time a little bit. So one nice thing about Springer Nature actually is because they have so many communities, there's over 30. Within Zapnito's model, these communities they're actually interconnected. And so I think this slide's not showing up so well on the webinar, but these clusters are actually different communities. And each little dot is a person. So you can see how what we're providing Springer Nature is a visualized way of visualizing how these communities are interacting, and how knowledge is being shared between communities. So, for example, this blue one at the top, I think, is a microbiology community, and this one down here is the ecology and evolution community. So it's a nice way of seeing the relationships between communities and between the individuals in the communities. So we're doing some quite interesting stuff here to establish how knowledge is shared, not necessarily just within the community, but within multiple communities. Is really interesting. The next bit actually is sort of talking about one of Springer Nature's models behind the paper, how they're driving really high quality traffic back to the journals. The traffic they get from the community back to the journal is very high quality compared to other social channels. So people that go to the community and then go through to the journal content, they spend longer reading the journal content. They read more pages on the journal. They're more likely to download PDF documents, and they're also very much more highly involved in the topic area as well. So, and that's leading to more submissions to the journal. So it's a very important source now for Springer Nature in terms of their workflows. Centaur Media, another case study that we'll just talk about quickly. So this is Centaur Media is a bit more on the thought leadership side. So Centaur launched a community for JP Morgan. The community was called the UK Edge, and so this is just really a community where JP Morgan are showcasing their thought leadership on UK equities. And so for example, they're publishing lots of content around Brexit, around what the Financial Conduct Authority is doing, recession, and then also the JP Morgan analysts themselves are here front and center. So Callum Abbott is a research analyst or research strategist at JP Morgan, and so as someone interested in this industry, I can learn what Callum Abbott is talking about. This is actually targeted. This community is targeted towards independent financial advisors and pensions advisors to encourage them to buy into JP Morgan's products. So it's a nice example of a thought leadership community. They also have a community called the Oyster Catchers, which is what I would call a directory model. And so Oyster Catchers is really it's a club of advertising agencies. So on this community, you've got lots of the leading advertising agencies in the UK interacting with each other and sharing their work essentially in order to attract the attentions of big brands. So you might be Ford Motor Company looking for a new advertising agency, and so you might find them on the Oyster Catchers. That's quite an interesting model for a community. So it's an example of a company community, if you like, rather than a community of experts. So that's also an interesting use case that we cater towards. In the B2B publishing space, that would commonly be referred to as a sort of a company directory model in the B2B space, B2B media. So just following up, sort of moving on to part 3, I guess, a bit more just about Zapnito. So we started out our reason for being is to power what we call expert communities. We're a software as a service community platform, and everything we're doing is being built to showcase expertise. So anything that encourages low quality content or lots of noisy content, we tend to steer away from that, and we steer towards providing our customers with tools for user-generated high-value content, and using that in the context of building new products. And so, you know, this phrase here, companies, their biggest asset is their experts. You know, they're using it to create branded expert networks and promote thought leadership. So it's just a sort of a slide around about us. These are just some more examples here. Evolution, we talked about. Vitality is an interesting one. That's where their Vitality is promoting towards sort of mortgage advisors, life insurance advisors. It's a thought leadership use case. Financial Times is another one where they're promoting business learning to executive learning through Financial Times and IE University. The next slide is just summarizing a bit around sort of the capabilities that Zapnito as a platform has. So it's kind of essentially a blend of collaboration tools and content publishing tools. So on the left-hand side, sort of social collaboration, conversations between people. It's very people-focused, peer-to-peer networking. And then on the right-hand side, sort of content marketing, thought leadership, and multi-networks. So that's kind of where we sit. Is that kind of Venn diagram, if you like. We're also not a purely a software company. We're also we provide services around these online communities as well. So we don't just sort of hand you the software and walk away and say good luck. We provide strategic planning services where we help you come up with the commercialization plans and the content plans for launching the communities and the audience engagement plans. Often we will do development work for customers. Some customers will want a specific feature, so those customers might say, look, John, we really like to have this feature, but we're happy to pay to have it built. And so we'll have an agreement with them where they're essentially contributing an idea into the Zapnito platform ecosystem, and then Zapnito will make that available to other customers as well. So Springer Nature, for example, has sponsored, being one of our bigger customers, they have sponsored lots of different features on the platform, and those platforms are then available to other customers. So when you buy into Zapnito, you're actually sort of joining a club, if you like, of publishers that are sort of using similar tools. There's also lots of options around site migrations and integrations into CRM tools, for example. And then we also have a sort of a site success model as well. So once you're launched, we don't just sort of walk away. We help you get the sites going and to a point of success. And that can include things like market research and testing and reporting. So the question came in just now, looks like a model that maps well to society goals. Do you work with membership societies? Yes, we do. Membership society is actually obviously quite relevant to what we're doing. So it's in societies, the membership is obviously the most important thing, and so it's definitely something we're able to work with. It depends really on what your goals are as a society. If it's to increase membership or provide value back to the membership, then that's something that we can do. You can essentially create maybe a kind of like a tiered model within the society. So if you've got in the society, maybe you've got I'm just obviously thinking about a scientific research example, but you might have professors, you might have fellows at a university, or you might have undergraduate students or postgraduate students. So you can quite easily create tiered models of experts within those communities. So the short answer is yes, and so happy to talk you through that a little bit more if you'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Actually, just on that question, one example of society model that we have is it's a federation of societies called FEBS, which is a Federation of European Biochemical Societies. So that's actually a federation of societies where they're providing value back to each of the societies around each European country. So hopefully that's answered your question. But please do come back to me more if you'd like to hear more on that. What I will do is just put on the last slide, there's just my contact information. So if you'd like to know more about what we've talked about, or maybe learn more about Zapnito or learn more about the topic, then please do drop me an email. My phone number's there as well, actually, if you want to try and catch me. Working hours, please, would be appreciated.
Thanks very much, John. That was really, really very interesting, and I'm sure online community certainly seems the way forward, and hope our listeners found that interesting and can potentially do something for maybe their sites as well. And if anyone is interested in learning more about Ingenta's publishing platforms, or any of our other products or sales, marketing, or research support provided by PCG, please get in contact with us. Ingenta actually run webinars on a monthly basis, so please follow us on our Twitter handle at WeAreIngenta, or the Ingenta LinkedIn posts, or visit our website to know what's actually being scheduled. Our contact is info@ingenta.com, so please get in contact with us if you want to book an appointment or if you want any further information. But thank you very much, John, for that excellent webinar, and thank you to our listeners. Goodbye then.